side of this program, and now I'm going to do a little of the other side, and we're going to do some wonderful ragtime music. Now, ragtime started off in very humble origins. It was in the brothels and saloons and down in the Mississippi. Most of the early ragtime pianists could not read or write music. They would sort of just play in these saloons, play one ragtime one day, and then sort of come up with another one the next day. It was just sort of a pattern they could do. The first one who was really able to write down these things was Scott Joplin, and so he would become one of the best known of the early ragtime composers. Joplin had an interesting early life. He was born in Texarkana in 1868. And his mom actually worked as a cleaning woman in the town for the white folk, and she would bring a Scott Joplin with her sometimes when she was cleaning homes. And if there happened to be a piano in the home, he would immediately run to it at age 5 or 6 and begin to play the piano as if he knew exactly how to do it. And word spread around town about this phenom of a kid, and there happened to be a Jewish pianist there named Julius Weiss, who offered him free lessons because he wanted to see what he could do. But he didn't just give him piano lessons. He taught him about theory, how to read the music, about Bach and Mozart, really gave him a great training. When Joplin he came from a very musical family, did Joplin. His mother and his father were both musicians and brothers. But when he was 13, his mother died. And at that point, his father said to Joplin, all right, it's time for you to get a real life, get a real job. And that's when Joplin left home. He wasn't interested in that. He started going up the Mississippi, listening to all these great ragtime pianists, sort of taking in all the ideas behind it. He ultimately would end up in Sedalia, Missouri, and there he would be working at a club, the Maple Leaf Club, and that's where the Maple Leaf Rag comes about. And he started writing all of these wonderful ragtime pieces, including The Entertainer that we will play and Easy Winner. Now, I'll jump ahead a little bit. The history of ragtime is kind of sad because it sort of disappears. Ragtime was a phenomenon when it first came out, as you'll hear. But by 1920, when jazz sort of started coming in on its own, ragtime was considered sort of old-fashioned and really was lost, almost unknown to history for about 40 years. Until the 1960s, some people kind of rediscovered these pieces. And then in 1973, the movie The Sting came out. And that really started this kind of a ragtime revival. The Sting had The Entertainer as its main theme. And of course, if you hear any ice cream truck right now, they are playing The Entertainer. So it's become sort of part of life. But Joplin himself never thought of himself as a ragtime composer. He thought he was a real composer and happened to write some ragtime music. But what he was really interested in was writing an opera that had some ragtime elements in it. And in fact, he wrote this opera called Tremonisha. He wrote it in New York City. By that time, he had moved out and had gone up to New York in 1915. And he had about 700 pages that he had written of this music. But he could not get anybody to invest in sort of putting money into it. Now, he went even to Harlem and played a kind of piano version of it, but they just weren't interested in putting on this big, lavish opera. It's got lots of dances in it and stuff. And so he basically has a nervous breakdown at that point, ends up in a mental institution a year later, and would die in a pauper's grave that was unmarked until 1968. And sort of tragic, the end of his life. But before he died, he actually told a few friends, in 50 years, they will be playing my music. And he was about dead on right, because ragtime would come about 50 years later. And a couple of years after that, The Sting comes out, the Atlanta Opera, for the first time, puts on this opera, Tremonisha, and it wins a Pulitzer Prize for being that. So. Now, the music in it is phenomenal. The plot stinks, but that's opera. What are you going to do? He was not alone in that problem. I think had he had some backing and some time, he would have figured out some better ways to move the plot. But there are some great dance numbers and wonderful rhythm and that syncopated rhythm that made ragtime so very different and so special. There's a wonderful letter written by a German tourist who had come to St. Louis in 1904 and had heard ragtime for the first time. And he writes a letter back to his wife, and he said, "Suddenly I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes which might be caused by a Strauss waltz, No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which is absolutely impossible to master. So it was something very different, this idea of ragging the rhythm, where the syncopation sort of throws off where your beat is and leaves you with this sort of excitement in your feelings. Now, as I say, ragtime spreads like wildfire. It comes up the Mississippi, and except in the Midwest, there were actually a number of wonderful female ragtime composers who we're still discovering, who wrote a number of really wonderful great hits in 1909, 1910, and then over into New York, and eventually across the ocean. And in fact, there's a wonderful quote from Igor Stravinsky in Russia, the great composer. He was asked what he thought about American music, and he said, "I know little about American music, except ragtime, and I consider that unrivaled. It is veritable art, and I can never get enough of it to satisfy me. I am convinced of the absolute truth of utterance in that form of American art," and then he finishes, "God forbid that you Americans should ever compose symphonies or fugues." So it wasn't the nicest ending, but he certainly liked his ragtime. That gets to so there's actually a story based on Russia that Seth will now tell you.
Oh, okay, all right. So this story may be somewhat apocryphal, but I read it on the internet, so it has to be true. Ragtime, swept the nation at the dawn of the 20th century and influenced just a whole generation of composers and songwriters. One of those songwriters who was very much enamored of ragtime was a young Jewish kid in Lower East Side of Manhattan by the name of Israel Isidore Baleen. You probably better know him with his nom de plume of Irving Berlin. Anyway, his first big hit in sheet music form was in 1911, when he got published Alexander's Ragtime Band, this ragtime song he had written. Now, it was hugely popular. You couldn't find a piano in this country in 1911 without a copy of Alexander's Ragtime Band on it. And in 1913, one of the earliest commercial records, phonograph records, was made of that song, sung by a singer named Billy Murray. Not Bill Murray the actor, Billy Murray the singer. And that became a hit record in the nascent American music industry. So now, go across the ocean, Russia. The Tsar is desperately trying to cling on to power as the Bolsheviks gain power. He is aided in this endeavor by his right-hand man, the kind of the puppet master, the man behind the curtain, Rasputin. And a bunch of Russian nobles conspire, don't worry, this goes somewhere. A bunch of Russian nobles conspire to kill Rasputin. So the one noble who's been asked to kill Rasputin, this part is definitely true, invites Rasputin over to his house. Now this noble was kind of cutting edge. He was kind of like a tech bro for his time. And he had a phonograph player, very unusual in Russia in the early 20th century. And he had that 1913 record of Billy Murray singing Alexander's Ragtime Band. And supposedly he says, "Hey, Rasputin, buddy, check this out." And puts on the record. Now try to imagine you're Rasputin. You've never heard any American music, nothing like ragtime or anything that sounds even remotely close to it. Not only that, you've never seen or heard a phonograph before. I mean, more than that, you've never heard music before without the musician right there in front of you. It must have been absolutely mind-blowing. And the story goes, the nobleman says, "Let me go get you a drink, check this out," puts on the record. Rasputin is just transfixed at what he's seeing and hearing and is staring at the phonograph, and that's when he's stabbed in the back. So, the moral of the story is, when we play these ragtime tunes, watch your back.
One last quote. So now, of course, as happens often with African American music when it filters into white society, there is fear and backlash that happens. It happens with rock and roll and rap music as well. And there were kind of an uproar about what this music was going to do to the next generation. This is from Musical America, a very mainstream journal in 1918, says the following. "The counters of our music stores are now loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic is finding its way into the homes and brains of our youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicions of their sanity. It is an evil music that has crept into the hearts of our people and must be wiped out as other bad and dangerous epidemics have been exterminated. A person once inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink. Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can only be treated successfully like a dog with rabies. So there was real fear about this music, but I think you'll be okay if you hear it. So here are a couple pieces by Scott Joplin.